You have found your way back into the hallowed chambers of Left Hand. This is Serpetie, a.k.a. Craig, of the Asset Horizon podcast and of the Left Hand podcast. And I just wanted to say thank you to everybody who supported me this year in launching this endeavor, my solo podcast, which focuses on the very specific interests that we sometimes cover on Asset Horizon, but where we delve deeper into the intersection between philosophy, politics, and psyche. Due to the very intense schedule I was forced to keep over the past several weeks, I was a little bit behind on putting out episodes of Left Hand. But fortunately, right here at the end of December, we're coming in with two big interviews. Today with Dr. Robert Langan on Jung and Spinoza. And to finish up the year, we'll have Taylor Adkins to talk about Freud's metapsychology. And after these two giants decided to step in and help me fill in some of the gaps in my production schedule, I will be back on track for January with the anticipated syllabus that I have laid out for the next few months. That said, I am happy to be interrupted. In fact, today's guests reached out to me because they thought they would be a good guest for the podcast, and they were. Now that the podcast is gaining some traction and everybody pretty much knows what's going on around here, if you know of a special guest that you think should be on this podcast, feel free to reach out to me on Patreon. Maybe it's you, maybe it's a friend, a professor, an author, whoever. In the meantime, once again, I just want to say thank you, and I really hope you enjoy yourself during this next hour and change because I think this is a great discussion. All right, let's get to it. This is Left Hand. This is Left Hand, and I am your host, Serpetie, a.k.a. Craig, from the Asset Horizon podcast, back with another special interview which has pleasantly intervened on my originally planned December programming. Today we have a very special guest, Dr. Robert Langan, or Bob. Dr. Langan, or Bob, holds a doctorate of psychoanalytic studies, whose work challenges us to rethink the intellectual and metaphysical relationships that underpin two towering and challenging figures in Western thought. His book, Jung and Spinoza, Passage Through the Blessed Self, forthcoming from Routledge Press in February 2025, is also his groundbreaking dissertation. In this text, he graciously allowed me to preview. Bob explores connections and tensions between Carl Jung's psychological theories and Baruch Spinoza's metaphysical system, offering a bold and nuanced perspective on how these thinkers resonate and diverge in their conceptions of psyche, spirit, matter, and the overall nature of reality. So in our conversation tonight, we'll explore the big questions raised in Dr. Langan's work. Is Jung closer to Spinoza than even Jung himself realized? How does the psyche act as what Bob calls a middle third between matter and spirit? And what does this conversation mean for how we approach philosophy and psychology and maybe even mysticism today? So, Bob, thank you for spending a late evening with me on the show.
Thank you for having me on. It's really good to be here.
Great. So really, so much to ask, and I've already asked so much in our preliminary discussions. Maybe just the first place to get started here is, what brought you to this question? What motivated you to explore the connection between Jung and Spinoza, especially given Jung's critique of Spinoza's metaphysics? But maybe you could also talk about which one of these figures you gravitated towards first and how you got into all of this business.
Well, that's a interesting question because I sort of found both Jung and Spinoza around the same time. I went to college. I did my undergraduate at Rutgers University, Camden, and I originally had pretensions of going into neuropsychology or something along those lines. So I was a bio major, psych minor. And that didn't work out too well after a while because I realized I didn't like lab work and I wasn't really any good at it, but I did really love theory. And one of the electives I had to take for the program I was in was a philosophy of minds and bodies course by a Dr. Charles Jarrett. And it just sounded interesting to me. So I went for it. And Jarrett is also a Spinoza scholar. He's published some notable papers within the Spinoza's field. And at some point, Spinoza came up in that class, and I read up on Spinoza myself. And I thought, you know what? I've been looking for something like this my whole life, I suppose, and I wasn't really aware of it. One of those situations. It just made sense to me off the bat in a way that a lot of other things never did. So that put Spinoza in my back pocket. But because of my background at the time, I didn't really have a true knowing of, where Spinoza was in the philosophical pantheon or anything like that, because I wasn't a philosophy major or anything like that. This was all sort of roundabout for me. Around the same time, because I also had that psychology minor and I had some interest in psychology as well. My dad was a businessman. And he was also very much into industrial psychology, if you will. And one of the books he had on his desk was about Myers-Briggs. And that was my introduction into Jung around that same time. And as you might know, typology it's not quite a heresy for a Jungian to get into Jung through that, but it's actually not looked upon very fondly by a lot of Jungians because it's, for some justifiable reasons, it's very stereotypical that someone who's very much in Myers-Briggs and uses it in the workplace to say, oh, well, if you're a ENTJ, you should be a CEO and, crap like that. That's not very healthy for anyone or useful. But I started reading the deeper theory there. Just one of those books caught my eye on my dad's bookshelf and I started reading through it. And what interested me more about that was just this idea that there were different styles of consciousness or different styles of ego consciousness. I don't know if I knew what the term ego was at that point, but that just kind of interested me. And he also had Jung's psychological types on his bookshelf. And if you've ever flipped through that book, a lot of it is pretty inscrutable unless if you know a lot of history, a lot of medieval history and a lot of history of literature, poetry. I mean, Jung goes pretty deep on it to make some of his points about typology emerging at different points in time. But he's also got that dictionary at the back of the book where he goes through his different terminology and different aspects of his system. And that's what first interested me in Jung. And I thought, oh, well, there's something to this unconscious business. I don't know what it is at this point, but I was definitely intrigued. Towards the end of my undergraduate, when I was flaming out spectacularly in biology, I had also, just through some personal things in my life, decided I need to know myself better. I need to, if there's something, I realized that I've been burned out in school, but I'm also rubbing a lot of my friends the wrong way. I don't like this part of myself. There's something I don't know about myself. And that's when I started taking the unconscious seriously. And that's when I sort of rediscovered Jung on a more serious level. And that's when I said, oh, gee, well, I should be studying this guy because this is sort of a linchpin of all my real interests, philosophy, depth psychology. This is when it started to coalesce for me. And I picked up Anthony Storr's book, The Selected Writings of Jung, I believe it's called. And towards the end of that, he talks about Jung's idea of the onus mundus, where psyche and matter are two forms of the same world. And as soon as I read that, I just thought, oh my God, he and Spinoza are saying something very similar here. Someone must have written about this by now. I need to look this up. And I couldn't find anything. And that really, at that point, that's when I said, you know what, if I go to school for this, I want to be the one who tackles this question. I had no idea there was going to be such a circuitous and complicated thing to answer. But that really, it just struck me at first glance with both of them that they were talking about something very similar in terms of their vision of God or monism or whatever you want to call it.
Great. Yeah. And so do you have any practical experience with Jung's work? Like, were you an analysand or were you in Jungian practice at any point?
No, I was not. No. And that's not too unusual for people who wound up going to school for my master's and ultimately my PhD where I went, which is the University of Essex. That's very, a lot of the students who go there, some indeed go on perhaps to go under analysis, or maybe they practice to become one themselves. But a lot of the students who go there are just interested in Jung purely from a scholarly pursuit.
I see. Just for you on a personal and maybe even professional level, academic level, why do you think Jung's work continues to attract those seeking a metaphysical grounding? And do you think Spinoza in any way provides the same sort of satisfaction to that kind of desire? And does this complicate the tension between, for example, like Jung's psychology and his metaphysics? One thing that I've talked about on the show, and one of the things that I appreciate about Jung's protege, who was James Hillman, is how Hillman really steers away from the metaphysics and goes deep into the psychology. As we were talking in our preliminary discussion or through emails, this particular work thrusts us square into Jung's metaphysics. And not that I was intentionally avoiding it, but I think I had made a sort of tacit decision like, don't need to go there right now. But here comes Bob Langan with the big book, and now I'm stuck.
Right.
Right. And very happy that I was stuck. So I'm just curious, looking at Jungian psychology and then looking at Jungian metaphysics, where do you see a big difference there? And like, how does Spinoza play a role in all of this?
Well, I think one of the reasons that Jung in this day and age still endures and people find a lot of interest in him is this acknowledgement of what he calls the numinous side of existence, and what my supervisor and mentor, Roderick Mayne, calls re-enchantment with the world, trying to find a certain magic and spiritualism to the world again. And Jung is very transparent about that. And I would go as far as to say he has contempt for other thinkers who don't allow for that. To me, maybe the core argument that Jung makes is that all psychic truths are primary, what we experience here, whether it's just me staring at my cup or if I'm convinced I saw a ghost in the attic or whatever, that psychic truth is primary and we should treat them as equal, whatever that means exactly. But that opens them up to be able to talk about anything, really. And Jung is not dismissive, therefore, of spiritualism and spirituality in the way that other psychologists, or perhaps Freud, at least openly, might have had different opinions covertly, but at least openly was very dismissive of. I mean, that's sort of the beginning of Jung after the break with Freud, right? Saying, I'm going to say yes to these things that are being considered taboo in terms of occultism and whatever. I think that's a big reason why, as someone who scans the Jungian field today, I get concerned because, I mean, as you know, one of the most popular quasi-Jungians or so-called Jungians out there is Peterson, right? And, you know, I have no love for the man myself, but I do get one of the allures to him in terms of theory is that, you know what, I don't like his version of Jung. I think it's a very fast food version of Jung, if you will, but he does understand that there is something to that numinous side of Jung that can't be dismissed. And one of my worries in some of the post-Jungian literature is that to try to fix problems in Jung psychology in terms of how much the inner is valued in opposition to the outer world, that we just kind of diminish that side of Jung to make it a little more palatable. And I think that endangers some of Jungian theory itself. In terms of, you know, how that connects to Spinoza and the tension there, you know, I think quite obviously Jung himself, at least openly, would say that Spinoza is too rationalistic in terms of his geometric method and how he presents things to be truly compatible. Other people who read Spinoza, and I would certainly agree with this, would say, well, no, I mean, what Spinoza is trying to do is to get you to look at things a certain way that does have that same affective sort of kinship with knowledge and understanding. And therefore, they're actually saying something similar. But that gap is there. That was one of the reasons why it was such a pain in the ass writing this thing for a long time, because for me, it's very obvious that, Jung and Spinoza are talking about similar things. But when their aesthetic is entirely different, when their approach to words, and there's so many different words that might trigger one or the other, to dismiss one or the other is so problematic. It gets very difficult to bridge that. And you kind of have to find those openings to sort of make the relationship work.
Maybe one thing that I'll say, this will sell the book. I was really happy about the introduction to the book. I mean, I've read Jung, I've read Spinoza, and my worry is with doing an episode like this is that the buy-in is if you like one of the thinkers, you're along for the ride. But if you don't know either of the thinkers, this is really tough. But I like how in the introduction, you present your struggle with the thesis and the process of getting into this research, then getting out of it, and then getting back into it with a kind of candor and humility that's very inviting. And this is a reason to read the book. And I think also because it's a dissertation too, you know, at certain points you're forced to recapitulate parts of your arguments that were in previous chapters. It makes it very easy to read. So if you're looking at the video right now, or if you're on the podcast and you want to check out the book, just drop into the show notes and click on the Routledge link and then grab Bob's book. But with that, I just want to relate a sort of autobiographical account that's very similar to yours. Is that, I mean, I kind of had the same experience you had with Spinoza, with Deleuze, especially coming off of like a very heavy Marx orientation for a while. But having had contact with Freud in the past and even Jung and Hillman in the past, and having set them aside, and then upon coming back, really appreciating something about the way that immateriality was handled in Deleuze's work, really spoke to me. And I would say that it was even repressed in some ways. So that when I came back to the work, there was ways that I could answer certain questions or address certain tensions in my own thought that were easier to navigate. I think the way that you illuminate Jung's relationship with Spinoza and just Jung's work in general gets us to see what Jung thought the stakes were. And I think they're pretty similar to ours in some sense. He wants to show that in a philosophical paradigm or construct where you have a binary distinction between matter and spirit, let's say, the question is, how do these things converge? How do we sort of like thumb over the little seam or the little line that exists between those things? And I mean, maybe the analogy is more complicated than that when it comes to the concept of psyche. So basically, I'm going to ask you to give us in short form Jung's argument, Jung's view of his tripartite schema for matter, spirit, and psyche. Like, what is psyche? How is it different than spirit? This is a challenging one, especially given our sort of conventional terms. And where does matter converge with psyche? How does that happen? And then how does this sort of tripartite function together as a unified whole?
So it might be helpful at first just to go over how Jung's metaphysics is typically depicted. In other words, dual aspect monism, just to set the scene. So in that scheme, as you know, it's typically seen as mind and matter are basically two expressions of some underlying psychophysically neutral substance, right? And this is typically how Jung's metaphysics, especially in his late work, is depicted in his dialogue with Wolfgang Pauli in regards to synchronicity. And then, a lot of more recent scholarship has been done on this by a number of people, but most notably Harold Atmanspacher, who's a physicist and Jungian scholar, who, basically goes through, because Jung and Pauli, they exchanged so many ideas through their letters, but they didn't really formalize a lot of it. And Atmanspacher does the work of going through that and saying, well, to me, it looks like they're espousing some kind of dual aspect monism. And then Atmanspacher also goes through at least Western thought and says who was one of the key originators of this idea. And he says, oh, look, Spinoza, because Spinoza, of course, has the two attributes that express God's essence. And those are at least two attributes, but the ones we know of are thought and extension, thought and matter, mind and matter. Again, looks like they're talking about the same thing. There are certain points in Jung's work, especially in his later mature work, but it's really there in his earlier writing as well, where he essentially says, well, if I am a dual aspect monist, for me, the two aspects of the monist whole are not psyche and matter, it's spirit and matter. And psyche plays some sort of role as a mediating middle third. And one example for me, this was sort of a smoking gun where he talks about this, was an exchange of letters, specifically in 1953 with Pauli. And Pauli comes to Jung because he's really upset about Answer to Job. He thinks that Jung is approaching the problem of God purely through an idealist lens, if you will. And he's saying, well, what about matter? You're not talking about matter. I thought we were both trying to find a neutral language. What are you doing here? And Jung's response is very interesting. He says, well, religion falls under the realm of spirit. And it only makes sense for me to therefore discuss it through a spiritual or ideal lens. And then he says, synchronicity involved matter. So I was talking about that more through the lens of physics and material things. This is an immaterial subject that I'm discussing in Answer to Job. So it's a completely different subject matter. And Jung basically says that the psyche is what interprets these two strata of ideas that we get, if you will, one from spirit and one from matter. So matter, of course, for Jung is all things that can be explained through physical sciences and material explanations, causality. Spirit, as he eventually says to Pauli, because Pauli, as he did throughout the relationship, is begging Jung for a little more clarity and definitions. Jung says spirit is basically all things that can't be explained through material causes. And he gives a wide category, or he gives many categories that fall under this. It can be metaphysical ideas, it can be theological ideas, it can indeed be paranormal experiences and claiming I saw a ghost or whatever. And it's also the stuff of a collective unconscious, like, symbolism in dreams, archetypal images, so forth. Jung is saying this is what falls under spirit. whereas knowledge of the body, knowledge of the world specifically, that would fall under the realm of matter. And the psyche is this middle third that gets the ideas, that captures the ideas of both, if you will. The psyche is through which all our ideas of both spirit and matter must pass through. So Pauli doesn't really quite get this, in all honesty. Pauli is convinced that Jung is just covertly trying to expand his psychology to do more and more and more. And he accuses Jung at one point of being the King Midas of psychology, basically. That everything he touches turns to psyche, no matter what. And it's actually interesting. This actually irritates Jung. He doesn't like this accusation. And he says, no, I mean, I'm the one who's trying to keep the psyche from overexpanding into things and that we don't project it into the cosmos. And in Jung's mind, it's been a real sin of intellectual thought for, millennia that psyche has been confused with pneuma, has been confused with spirit, and the two things have been mixed up. Whereas, yes, the psyche, has a spiritual component in the sense that it interacts with spirit and it deals with spirit, but it's also very much connected to the body as well. This is another part of Jung as well, where we tend to assume that he avoids he does avoid reductionism, but avoid any clear typical talk of like the psyche being dependent on the body, for instance. But he does say this at points, and it is a little strange. In Phenomenology of Spirit and Fairy Tales, he says, well, while we know spirit is totally immaterial, the psyche clearly has some connection to the body. And even in Mysterium Connectionis, which is his last great work, and in the eyes of many, where he is really laying out some grand metaphysical system, at one point he plainly talks about the psyche having causal connections to the body. Sometimes people just dismiss this as Jung being sloppy, but I do think it suggests really more him wrestling with, okay, well, psyche clearly has some sort of kinship with a body, but then there's this stuff that I'm saying is not strictly within the intrapsychic, all these other ideas and all these other immaterial things that are outside the psyche, and that's spirit for Jung. So that's where Jung, in that 1953 exchange of letters with Pauli, really sets out the tripartite monism. But again, he mentions it in other places as well, and On the Nature of the Psyche from 1946. I mean, that in a lot of ways sets the stage for the last era of Jung's work. He sets out a spectrum where you have spirit on the lower end, psyche in the middle, and spirit on the higher end. And he basically says, well, the archetypes manifest both in matter and in spirit. And the psyche, again, is sort of what experiences this manifestation of both archetypal spirit and archetypal matter. What Jung is doing here, I think, is he's trying to grapple with, how do I explain things that are outside of the intrapsychic? And this is something that I think Jung wrestled with throughout a lot of his career. One of the things he's trying to account for after his confrontation with the unconscious and the fallout with Freud is he has all these visionary experiences in his confrontation with the unconscious. I think in some ways he knew even then this couldn't be explained purely intrapsychic, but he had some reasons, I think some personal reasons, to keep it that way. And ultimately, the questions that his psychology, as he talks about it on the nature of the psyche, that his exploration of the unconscious led him to things he had no idea that he would be exploring. And those are the concepts in Jung's late work that we all know: flying saucers, civilization and undiscovered self, synchronicity, transference in an intrapsychic way with multiple people. These are things he had to have expand his theory to account for, and spirit was one way of doing that, by saying, okay, I need to totally distinguish between an intrapsychic realm and an ideal realm beyond the psyche proper, if you will.
Let's open up a little discussion about psyche itself. Where we started is that it's this middle third term that is neutral in character. Yet when we explore the concepts in Jung and his successors like Hillman, for example, psyche is responsible for our individuation. It's that force within us when we apply focus to the images of the unconscious or the imagination, whatever we want to call it, that is what gets cultivated. It gets elaborated. It infuses our life, and it's therefore responsible for individuation, or the deep sort of nourishment, the deepest kind of nourishment that we could have spiritually or psychologically in our lives. How is that neutral? If there is a sort of purposive element within psyche, how does Jung rectify that amidst trying to situate psyche as this term that negotiates between matter and spirit?
Yeah, this is one of the tricky things with Jung, where I This reminds me a bit of Bernardo Kastrup, who has a really neat book called Decoding Jung's Metaphysics. And he argues that Jung is a metaphysical idealist, which I don't agree with. I think Jung, again, is seeking something in between idealism and matter. But one of the points that Kastrup falls back on this is that obviously the symbolism, the contents of the unconscious that we're dealing with that leads to an individuation, like you're talking about, have an idealist character, have an ideal character. So, in terms of the archetypal image of the shadow or the anima or the animus, whatever. And to him, this leads him down that idealist lens. I think this is where Mysterium Conjunctionis, from at least just a Jungian perspective, is very handy, because Jung goes through these different stages of the conjunctions and comparing it to the alchemical process, and comparing it to individuation, where there is this unio mentalis, where the psyche rediscovers spirit, connects with spirit, and this reveals, if you will, the ideal character of the psyche itself. The psyche does have an ideal character to it, and this is also where you get into the Spinozist end of the thesis, and it gets a little more into the reeds. But for now, let's just stick with the Jungian aspect of it, where the psyche deals with spirit. In some ways, it is the ideal character of a body or a singular body. So it does have a spiritual aspect to it. So it does deal with these things, and it does unite with spirit. And then from there, that psyche spirit union then reunites with the body, and then ultimately with the world itself. So you have this process where the psyche submerges itself in idealism, then submerges itself back in the outside world. But that latter step is very crucial. Yes, it is indeed a idealist character to unite with spirit and to unite with the contents of a purely ideal plane or the collective unconscious, what have you. But then even Jung says this, and one of my quibbles with Jung that I certainly wrestle with in the book is, does a classical version of individuation really deal with the outer world enough? But even Jung says, once you have this unio mentalis, the true individuation, finding the goal, truly comes re-emerging with the world, or reconnecting with the world, reconnecting with the body, and then reconnecting with the world. So yes, it obviously has an idealist character, but then there is materialism to it as well. And I think this does explain those weird passages where Jung does talk about the psyche and the body having some sort of connection that's less evident between spirit and matter, because Jung is aware that, Jung even talks about at points that, if I have damage to the brain, that affects my conscious or personal unconscious in some way. Jung doesn't dismiss these things. So he does know there's some sort of interdependency between psyche and body. But the psyche, again, it sort of travels between both domains. And this was something that was hard for me to puzzle out myself for a long time. The Spinozist angle was sort of my personal way of doing that, because then for Spinoza, all knowledge has a bodily affective character, but then our way of rearranging those affections to find an active effect, that is a very idealist task as well. And I think that's comparable to that unio mentalis that Jung is talking about. So, it's a process that goes through both. It's tricky to write that without falling back into reducing one or to the other. And I think that's the problem that Jung was really wrestling with too.
Maybe one of the ways that we can navigate towards the view of Spinoza is through Hegel, because there's speculation that Jung's negative stance towards Spinoza that he takes in the phenomenology of spirit and fairy tales is that he recapitulates some version of Hegel's critique of Spinoza, which is there's a kind of inertness to substance, and that Hegel believes that Spinoza theorized substance in such a way that it accorded too much spirituality to it. And whereas some have leveled the charge at Spinoza that he was an atheist, Hegel believed that there's actually too much God in the notion of substance. Maybe you could unpack that a little bit, and then we'll go to the Spinoza piece.
Yeah, the Hegel critique of Spinoza is really interesting because, to my mind, Jung either directly or indirectly was influenced by it and apes a lot of it. But Hegel looks at Spinoza and he congratulates him for seeing that spirit and matter are two aspects of the same whole, rather than seeking a dualism or a causality between one or the other. But then in Hegel's mind, there's something lacking in the attributes. They don't do enough. They can't uphold themselves. Hegel wants a more dynamism to spirit. He wants it to have that ability to turn back on itself. And he doesn't see that in Spinoza's philosophy. And therefore, he thinks that, everything that the attributes supposedly contain, these finite modes, are illusory, because Spinoza's not, it's too static. The attributes aren't really saying how things can really escape substance. They're just going to collapse back into substance. What Hegel does here, and he rather establishes it, is this subjective interpretation of Spinoza's attributes, where the attributes don't really exist. They're sort of what we perceive from substance. And indeed, that's how we perceive ourselves from substance, but it's not a true distinction. They're not really there. And therefore, for Hegel's mind, in Hegel's mind, again, there's too much God and we all collapse back into it. What's interesting for Jung and phenomenology of the spirit and fairy tales is, that essay is by far where he affords Spinoza the most attention in his work. He doesn't talk about Spinoza a lot in his work. He mentions him by name just 7 times in all the collected works. But in that essay, he mentions him multiple times and really indirectly throughout the entire opening, where he's discussing how, again, in Jung's mind, this concept of spirit is very important for him. In this essay, he's treating how spirit has been used or misused throughout the history of thought in his mind. And he levies against Spinoza the charge of both inflating it into a pure cosmic idealism, and just like the Hegelian argument, he claims this can't be upheld, so it just collapses back into a dead, inert materialism. And therefore, just like Hegel, Jung is saying, well, Spinoza's substance really is just a barren wasteland. There's no formation in it. It just exhausts itself in trying to produce anything, but there is nothing really there.
I want you to talk a little bit about the secret of the golden flower. Do you believe that Jung's interpretation of Spinoza's metaphysics is influenced by his engagement with Taoist thought?
I do, because I personally think, I don't know this for sure, but reading Jung's commentary on The Secret of the Golden Flower, to me, that's one of the earliest instances where he talks about spirit and matter separately, and how spirit without matter just floats away and matter without spirit is lifeless. And he's talking about Psyche in the middle in a lot of ways in his commentary there. So I think that's where he sort of, one of the earliest instances, because I believe that's from 31, one of the earliest instances where he openly talks about that tripartite monism. And yes, I do think Taoism, Eastern thought, his alchemical research, I do think that informed his metaphysical position, and that did lend him towards this collision course with Spinoza, if you will. I absolutely do think that. That's always a question, and that was always a question in my research, which is, how much of this is Jung knowing that he and Spinoza are saying the same things, and how much of this is just homologous strands of thought that met at the same point, right? And, we know that Jung had, at least a copy of the Ethics in his library, and he cites it a few times in the collected works. And in my opinion, he uses certain Spinoza's terms in his writings, such as subspecie eternitatis, with enough sophistication where, obviously there were other thinkers after Spinoza who used that term, Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, but he uses it in a way that accords with the way Spinoza meant to deploy the term, which is telling to me. So I think he had some passing understanding of that. I think if he didn't have that other influence from quote unquote Eastern thought and ancient thought weighing on him, it would have been a lot easier for him to dismiss the Spinoza's position. But I think that becomes impossible for him to do, because he knows the validity of these other things that he believes in.
One of the most difficult things I think to get on board with in Jung's thought is, particularly if you're of a quote unquote materialist orientation, is the concept of archetypes. Now, if you're a Neoplatonist, this is probably a pretty easy move to make. But even within Jung's work, this is something that he worked on in the various periods of his life. The concept of archetype was developed over time. And then if you look at Hillman, he says that he's faithful to Jung, but I think there's a certain reading of archetype that he tends to amplify or prefer in some ways. And even Deleuze, I mean, I don't know how familiar you are with Deleuze, like Anti-Oedipus, but the archetype gets a mention in there. It's one of the things that populates on the body without organs. So it's taken as a minor concept within that particular text. But here, or in your work, it's the connection that you're trying to make is that you're aligning the concept of archetype with the Spinoza's attribute of thought. But there's also a difference between archetypes as such and specific archetypes, like the shadow, for example, or the anima or animus. So maybe first, let's start with What is your definition of an archetype? And then how do we differentiate between an archetype and an archetype as such? And then how does this cash out in an understanding of Jung through the Spinozist lens?
So, I mean, the most pure Jungian definition of the archetype that I would roll with is there are dominant patterns of the unconscious, and there are patterns that we, of course, all share. They're not something that's personally derived. They're something that through some means is part of this collective unconscious. And Jung, earlier in his writing, he's grappling with how to distinguish this from instinct. At first, he kind of wants to keep it very similar to instinct. And in earlier writing, when he's Jung, when he's trying to figure out the archetypes throughout his writing, he at times chases trends of the time to explain them. So in his earlier writings, when he first starts talking about the archetypes in the late teens, early 20s, he talks about Bergson a lot and some sort of elan vital. He brings that up a lot in terms of a complement to instinct, more pure biological instinct. And then he realizes that doesn't quite sell, and he goes further with it. And it's not really until On the Nature of the Psyche in 1946, again, a pretty seminal essay in terms of Jung's development as a thinker, where he really makes clear this distinction between the archetypal image and the archetype as such. So the archetypal image would be the specific representation or symbolic representation of an archetype in one's life. So, for instance, the anima, which in terms at least of a traditional heteronormative male would be the, womanly image inside their unconscious, so to speak. That might be projected onto, a spouse, associations with even the mother, although that can, get clouded into this question of how do we distinguish one archetype from another in terms of like a mother archetype. But, the anima can be projected onto different women in a man's life in this very traditional example. So these projections and these apparitions of them could be seen as an archetypal image. Or if I have a dream where the anima is represented, that can be an archetypal image. But then whatever's being represented by that, whatever underlying source, if you will, or structure of the archetype would be the archetype itself or the archetype as such. And, Jung is trying to ape some sort of Kantian distinction between the phenomenal and the noumenal. And there's a lot of critique. There's a lot of, scholarship about how careful and how accurate he is in doing this. But that's sort of his pretense. In a lot of ways, I personally think that's his get out of jail free card from having to really go deeper with it. But of course, he can't help himself at some points and does go deeper with it. So again, you have these appearances of an archetypal image in dreams, projections onto other people in your life, so forth. But then also Jung is trying to account for, especially in late work, but really early on as well, material manifestations of an archetype as well in terms of synchronicity. The oft-repeated, exhaustively repeated example is the recalcitrant patient that Jung has, who's very rationalistic, a Cartesian mind, Jung says at one point, and is very resistant to analytical psychology. And then she has a dream that involves a scarab beetle, and she's talking about it with Jung the next day, and a beetle flies up to Jung's window, and he opens the window, and he hands the beetle to the patient and says, here's the beetle you're looking for. That would be a physical manifestation of the archetype. So Jung says, wait a minute, I've been talking about these ideal symbols of the archetype, the archetypal images, but I also have these material manifestations as well. How do I explain both? And this is where, especially on the nature of the psyche, where he introduces the concept of the psychoid aspect of the archetype. And the psychoid aspect of the archetype is very much overlaps with the archetype as such, as it's the archetype, the true archetype that's represented both in spirit and matter. And it almost presses whatever it needs into its ability to exist at that point in time where it erupts from the unconscious, whether it's purely in terms of an ideal character, in terms of symbology, or within a physical manifestation. Jung is acknowledging, okay, I can't always account for how an archetype manifests. It can be purely ideally. It can be through material causes as well. But there's something beyond both. I mean, when people talk about the psychoid, when Jungian scholars talk about the psychoid, Anne Addison, who's with University of Essex, she has some wonderful books about connecting it to instinct and biology. But Jung is also talking about it in terms of, okay, I'm also talking about it when it has this ultraviolet expression, if you will, in terms of spirit. And what Jung is saying there, the psychoid for me is this acknowledgement that archetypes are beyond both spirit and matter. They're expressed in both aspects, just like psyche is expressed in both aspects as well, which then implies that in some way there's something about psyche and the archetypes themselves that are both being expressed through spirit and matter. And just to dovetail back to the 1953 exchange of letters between Pauline and Jung, again, that was the moment for me researching all this where I realized, oh, okay, Jung is talking about spirit and matter being these two aspects, and everything is in the middle. Because in those letters as well, he tells Pauline, well, the archetype can manifest in spirit and it manifests in matter. And he's basically saying it has the same function as psyche in that sense. And that's when I saw, okay, there's this plane here where everything exists very similar to what Spinoza says. You want me to go right into Spinoza and archetypes now?
We can, but actually, I'm quite curious then on Jung's account metaphysically. I mean, we're getting to the point now where we see a kind of interleaving between matter and spirit in the register of psyche. So then the question would be something like, do archetypes evolve? Is matter the plane upon which the metastability of an archetype is inscribed and changes over time? Does Jung even go that far into the metaphysics to secure this concept?
That's interesting with Jung because I think it's been a critique in post-Jungian literature. Well, he doesn't challenge the archetypes enough. Or on the contrary, post-Jungians will try to ascribe archetypes as laws of nature to some extent, whether we find them bound in genetics and our genetics, or somehow they're equivalent to actual laws of physics somehow. But Jung is open to some extent of them changing in character, and a panentheist view of somehow what we do as a back reaction to change their expression in a way. And I think as we record this, we're on the heels of, as I'm sure you know, all this hysteria of the drone hysteria here over in New Jersey.
Oh, are you near it?
Just like 20 minutes from it. Yeah.
Oh,
it's been more over like suburbia, South Jersey, but everyone's been freaking out about it. I got to tell you, I don't live far from an Air Force base, so I see stuff in the sky all the time. I don't think twice of it, but there is this hysteria, whether it's real or not, whatever it is, everyone's freaking out about it. So I couldn't help but start reading bits of Flying Saucers, which is Jung's brilliant book from the late 50s, really inventive, out there, wacky book where he tries to give some sort of psychological account of UFOs. And what Jung says in that book is, well, it's not the question, at least ostensibly, that doesn't interest him is whether they exist. What he's fascinated by is that people want them to exist. And there's an appetite for them to exist. And he's asking why. So he starts to develop this psychological account. And he's basically saying it's making a new technological myth, if you will, a myth of the time, a myth of, okay, in this same period of time where we've discovered atomic power and we have the capacity to kill ourselves as a species in an instant, we're inventing these gods from the skies who are coming and evaluating us. And maybe they're benevolent or maybe they're malevolent. We don't know which. And Jung connects, obviously, the saucer shape with mandalas and the self and that wholeness of the self. And he can't help himself there. And he does that. And there's merit to doing that. But he's also saying this is a new expression. This is a new myth. And is that totally him saying, okay, an archetype, for instance, is totally voided from this period in history? No, not necessarily. But he is opening the door to, okay, our changes in history, our changes in culture can vary the way these archetypes appear or actualize in our time too. So he does leave the door open to that. It's not quite saying, okay, this archetype might just cease to exist for this period of time. I don't think he would allow himself to go that far. I'm not sure if that's right either, but he is open to that back reaction.
Yeah, I kind of had the same thought when the drone hysteria started to get whipped up. It did echo what Jung was addressing in the Flying Saucers book.
Yeah.
And there's a way that we can talk about it where there's a very sort of short step that we take from flying saucer to drone. And then, right.
It's not a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, it really is. And I think at a time where we are at the precipice of Armageddon, it doesn't surprise me that there is such a profound interest in these objects. And like, I mean, I'm not even going to talk about the certainties or the uncertainties around it because my inbox will be flooded with stuff.
I'm sure it will be. Yeah, I'm sure it will be. Be careful. Yeah.
So I will reserve my comments on that. But strictly from a psychological perspective, it's a matter of interest. And I think the resonance that's created by this event does vindicate Jung in some sense.
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
think this is one place where we can say, yeah, good on you, man. But yeah, maybe then this takes us to the sort of hinge between Jung and Spinoza. And actually, I kind of took a different tack in like connecting them, but it definitely goes hand in hand with things that you worked on in your book here. I was thinking about archetypes and individuation in terms of destiny. I have acorn theory on the brain from Hillman, but I mean certainly something like that is in Jung's work. But then in Spinoza, we have this highly deterministic philosophy and this concept of the conatus. And so there's a way in which I think we could attach conatus to something like the individuation process and psyche as the motor of it. And then destiny and the deterministic view of Spinoza. Do you see these not simply being as just like, oh, there is clearly a parallel at the terminological level, but does it all work out in the details too?
Yeah, there's no doubt there's a parallel between Spinoza's call for us to find active joys, to cultivate active effects through reason. And through that, we discover the power of our own essence. Essence was a big term for me in terms of Spinoza that just, came up more and more when I was writing this. In terms of actualizing our own essence, our own capacity to affect things, there's definitely a parallel with that. And Jung talking about discovering the self, the individuation, the cultivating of oneself, of one's unconscious potential as well. That's absolutely there. The biggest issue and the biggest roadblock to connecting the two, because in terms of their theories of knowledge, which I think is inseparable from their theories of knowing oneself, because for both Jung and Spinoza, it seems all knowledge of things is routed through knowledge of oneself. You have to pass through, just like we were saying earlier, you have to pass through the psyche to understand things of either a spiritual or material basis. For Spinoza, it's the same way. True knowledge comes from understanding common notions or common relations between myself and other things. I mean, to me, there's a lot of really interesting connections there that I had a hunch were there when I started writing this, but it just started coming out more and more. And how in terms of knowledge is inseparable from affect or inseparable from emotion, if you will. I mean, Jung and Spinoza both seem to strongly agree on that. The biggest issue for this is that for Spinoza, those connections and therefore our adequate knowledge of things and our ability to form true reason is always predicated on relationship with other things. It's always predicated on a relationship of how something affects us and how we react to that affection, or how we learn to understand our connection to that other mode affecting us or that other individual affecting us. And therefore, what part of it is true about ourselves. But it's always predicated on a relationship with the outer world. Jung, in a classical sense, it starts out similar in the terms of something on the outside affects me, or I'm projecting onto something and I don't really understand why. I like to go back to, example of projecting my anima onto a potential spouse or, relationship situation or whatever. For Jung, again, in a classical sense, it becomes, okay, once I understand the complex in my unconscious, and there's an archetype at the core of the complex, once I grapple with that, once I reckon with that, the projection in theory will be withdrawn, and then I'll understand the archetype within myself that was causing that. The problem with that is that it becomes a very inward affair compared to what Spinoza is saying. And that's the real tension, in my opinion. That's also, for me, what Jung struggles with Spinoza a lot, or Spinoza's viewpoint a lot, which is, okay, I see something similar here. I see we both are embracing some sort of, pantheism, panentheism, transcendental immanence, whatever term you want to throw at it. We're saying something similar in our ontology. But man, I don't want to violate the interior world, the inner world like this. I kind of want this to be the dominion within the dominion, says Jung. So, there's examples within Jung's own life of this problem. I was rereading a bit of Mark Sabin, who's also at the University of Essex, and he has a wonderful book called Two Souls Alas. And he's talking about, Jung, what he called his number one and number two personality. And anyone who's read Memories, Dreams, Reflections, his memoir, knows about this, where Jung said, even from an early age, he was aware that he felt like he had two personalities. The number one personality, which was engaged with the everyday, the scientific, the career-minded academic. And then he had this number two side of himself, which he thought was spiritual, timeless, mythological, archetypal. And Sabin does really good work there of showing how he basically analyzes Jung. He does a really good job of showing how Jung was always eager to try to share the number two side of himself, but it was a pattern where it would consistently fail and he was hurt or wounded afterwards. He tries to share this dream he has of his father when he's a young boy, and his father just dismisses it and Jung is hurt. Later on, he tries the same thing with Freud by trying to bring Freud on with, spirituality, occultism, the idea that the libido is not purely sexual. And Freud, of course, is aghast against it. And how this is depicted in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, and in typical valorization of Jung is to say, well, Freud came in and sort of chastised Jung for these beliefs, and Jung bravely walked out. Sabin has a bit of a different view about it. He's not the only one to do this. Renos Papadopoulos, another famed UK Jungian, he has a great paper about this from 1991 about Jung and the Other. And he's talking about how really Jung and Freud never had they were never really on the same page. Freud, obviously, his, classic psychoanalytical theory was about repression, a very vertical model of the psyche. Jung, from very early on in his career, was interested in a lateral psyche of disassociation, of complexes, of a splintering psyche that goes laterally. A lot of people say you got to read the late Jung to really understand them. But in a lot of respects, I found you really got to know the early Jung before the fallout with Freud to kind of get the geometry, if you will, of what he's trying to say, because that sort of lateral vision of the psyche sticks with Jung throughout his whole life and his whole career, I think. So anyway, Sabin points out very, very well that Jung, even though he's catering to the number one side of himself, this career-minded, scientific-minded side of himself by getting in league with Freud, going with the psychoanalytic group, trying to make that his career, still trying to make the number two side of himself work as well by trying to bring Freud on board. And Freud, of course, is very wary. And even though he allegedly had his own covert interests in the occult, he didn't want to endanger his fledgling fields with this kind of controversial stuff. So he dismisses it. And Sabin basically says after that, Jung never seriously tried to bridge those two aspects of himself again. And to protect the number two side of himself, he made it a very interior affair. There was this becomes a secret complex, Sabin calls it. So that really set off a light bulb for me when I read that, because I was like, okay, there's a secret complex. We have Joe Cambray, Jungian from California, who was one of the first Jungians to point out in a paper from 2014 Jung's weird relationship with Spinoza and how he barely mentions him, but there seems to be a charged negative reaction at times with how Jung comments on Spinoza, even though they're talking about the same things. Jung will sort of distance himself, and Cambray says, well, it seems like Jung has a bit of a Spinoza complex. Why? So that set me off too. And then, of course, the other ingredient with this was spirit. And spirit seems very tied to Jung's number two, that timeless side of himself, personality, because the experience of spirit is something that he claims he has after the fallout with Freud and the confrontation with the unconscious. Again, a bit mythologized, because if you read Memories, Dreams, Reflections, you think Jung was just talking to the characters in his head the whole time when he was still fulfilling some professional obligations. There were his colleagues were helping him through the process. Again, a lot of this stuff sort of gets compressed in the telling of Jung's life. If you just know Jung from Memories, Dreams, Reflections, you would think the only three people in his life was his father, Freud, and God, basically. Like, you would think that was it, but he really deals with a lot of people, and a lot of the women in his life, both, erstwhile clients and then also colleagues like Sabina Spielrein, Tony Wolff. They help him develop a lot of his ideas. When Jung writes about these ideas afterwards, he talks about it as if he was just talking to the anima the whole time. And there was just maybe some projection over there outside of himself. There was almost sort of a surface nuisance that he needed, like writing on a chalkboard, if you will, to get the ideas out. He diminishes these things. And there's a lot of reasons why. We can talk about Jung maybe just not treating the women in his life well, too, and sexist attitudes, whatever. But it is also just this desire to see things purely through himself, through the archetypes in himself. So the big dilemma becomes, okay, as much as Jung and Spinoza seem to be saying the same thing, Jung keeps it a totally intrapsychic affair where we withdraw everything and experience everything from within. Spinoza's demanding a more outbound view of things. And then the other consequence of that is, for Jung, the universal, the archetypal, the numinous seems to have to be purely intrapsychic, and there's nothing out here. The outer world gets diminished in comparison. And that's the big dilemma.
And that's what we call then the introverted bias of Jung. And post-Jungians today seem to be wanting to, like yourself, kind of remove the occlusion that would then move that introverted side of the theory, the discipline, and the practice out into the world in some way. I'm just going to do a little kind of sidebar here. Are you into dreams? Do you like monitor your own dreams? You write your own dreams down and stuff?
I do.
Me too.
I'm just gradually getting more organized about doing it, but I do. I treat my dreams very significantly. I've I can remember and have documented certain points in my life, and it is admittedly in those very classical Jungian ruptures in my life where I've had some pretty significant dreams and recurrent symbology. But yes, I do take that very seriously.
Here's the thing. If you know me, I'm somebody who considers themselves like pretty radical, like left wing. Like I understand Jung's like a right wing person, to like pretty much like today he would be like a centrist with right wing leanings.
Just a sidebar on that quickly because I know it's not totally related, but if you've ever read his seminars on Thus Spake Zarathustra and on Nietzsche, and because that was in the mid 30s, he talks about Nazi Germany at times, and it's the most centrist sort of. I know this is bad, but it doesn't. I know this guy's a lunatic because by then Jung had started to distance himself, even though early on he might have been a little more foolish about it. But I know this is lunacy, but it's not really going to affect me. It's fine. It's completely that sort of centrist, I'm above it all, it's okay sort of attitude. But at any rate,
in my case, I think the reason that I continue to like kind of keep Jung on my loop of go-to theorists is because of my dream life, my fantasy life, and I mean I'm just going to make an interesting connection here that actually puts me pretty close to Jung in some ways. The first time that I went to psychoanalysis, I was an analysand of Toshio Kawai. I don't know if that name rings a bell. He's the son. Yeah, he's the son of Hayao Kawai, who was basically the most famous Japanese Jungian. And I forget how I was introduced to him, but he agreed to take me on as an analysand. And I remember the first time that I tried to communicate with him. At that time, my Japanese was pretty good. I had written like a whole thing in Japanese to this guy. Basically, here's what's on my mind. Here's why I'm coming down to analysis. And this was at the time when Microsoft Word had a really hard time translating between a Western OS and like the Japanese OS. And all of my Japanese characters got converted into just like garbage Unicode. And he responded to me in English. He's like, "What the hell is this? Like, just tell me what you want to say."
Right.
And so my message didn't get to him, and that just affected me so deeply. It was like because I was exploring that introverted side of myself, and like I opened that aperture. It really affected me. And it's interesting because on the other end of that is me going to this other analyst that I went to in Los Angeles for a few months, Michael Geller, who was great. But I don't know, have you've seen pictures of my dome online?
Yes.
Yeah. So the reason I built the dome is because of stuff that I saw in analysis. He actually told me to go, he's like, I had a dome in a dream. He's like, what if you built a dome? And that's one of the reasons I have the dome. And once everything was said and done, like a year after having finished it and having moved and somewhat actualized myself with the podcast and everything, I had written to him with a picture. I was like, hey, just wanted to let you know, I finished the dome. I did all the stuff, there you go. And I didn't hear back from him. I'm like, you know what? That just happens. People get busy. 6 months later, didn't hear back. It's life. People move on. And then I was just in my drafts one day, and the message never went. At either ends of my analysis experience, there's this utterly personal communication, this failure to launch and reach out to whether it's, the wise old man archetype or something like that. And it just boomeranged back to me. And once I saw that sort of completed a strand for me. I was like, okay, I get it now. And
you saw the whole passage of it. Yeah.
I saw the whole passage of it, all the tension of the decades between that first Unicode fuck up and then whatever happened with the dome email. Like I was like, okay, those are two bookends of something. But anyway, I'm sharing that. I don't know if that sparks anything in you and your experience.
Yeah, totally. As I even talk about in the intro of the book, I mean, I kind of use Spinoza to bully Jung to get him to open up more, but it's hypocritical of me because just writing this damn thing was sort of the same struggle where it was like, okay, I know there's something here, but man, putting this out there is a big risk, and I don't know if it's quite right. I don't know how to do it. And it was sort of that same sort of fear. Now, obviously, that has a pure intellectual, scholarly component of just not wanting it to be wrong, too. But it is that same thing, and that's happened many times in my life in terms of just, whether it's writing, fiction or nonfiction, getting it out there. There's sort of that mode where I almost expect something to go wrong, like you're talking about. And sometimes it's just an unforced error, so to speak. And it's like, oh, okay, sometimes things just go wrong. And it's almost that test for me at some points in my life where, in things writing or publishing, or for instance, getting the thesis done, where it's sort of, okay, something comes up where there's a setback. Do you really want this or not? Or, what's wrong here? Are you just going to get hard on yourself? And there are those moments of tension where something comes up. And, you said that's why these are the kind of things why you can't totally give up on Jung. And I would say that's the same thing for me as well, where he sort of gives, a language to explain that sort of subliminal affect. And I think that's the genius of him in a lot of ways. And that, he has the same problem. He has the same problem because he, as we're talking about, he deals with this same aspect of sharing his ideas, and not just even after Freud, even with Pauli, I think he kind of realizes at some point they're not talking about the same thing. Again, in terms of tripartite monism versus a more neutral two-aspect thing that Pauli was after, and that was a very intellectual friendship, at least my reading of it is, so that didn't bother Jung. But then there's also Father White, a priest that he got very close with. They disagree with the problem of evil, and it's a weird reversal where Jung is the master sort of rebuking Father White, and they go their separate ways, and a reversal of Freud. And then he tries to rectify it because he hears Father White got into a motorcycle crash, and in that crash they found out he had a terminal cancer, and he passes, but Jung tries to patch up their relationship then. But it's sad because it's the same pattern in a lot of ways, and that's one thing I love about Jung, which is that kind of explains that life are these sort of recurring patterns that you have to meet and not necessarily try to break, but just have that moment of understanding. And again, maybe that's the Spinoza's turn in me as well, but that moment of understanding that unlocks it. Just like you said, okay, this never sent. Now I understand the passage. This email never sent it. Now I understand the passage. It's sort of the same thing, I suppose.
With that said, talking about coming out of our introverted shell, I want to talk a little bit about Deleuze and Spinoza. Do you think there's a difference? Because, of course, you've come across the work of Christian Kerslake in your own work, I'm sure, especially to work on something like this, and the convergence between Jung and Deleuze, which we've had episodes on here. Do you see that there's any sort of difference between bridging Jung and Spinoza and bridging Jung and Deleuze? Or are there any similarities?
There's certainly similarities, but there are differences. The book that you just referenced, Deleuze and the Unconscious by Christian Kerslake, that came out, I think, in 2007.
Yeah.
And I started at University of Essex in 2011. That book wasn't, at least on the Jungian scene, well read at that point. The only person I knew for sure who read it was my friend and colleague at Essex, Christian Macmillan, not to be confused with Christian Kerslake, who he did his doctorate on Jung and Deleuze. And this is germane to your question because he went into that at first, I think, trying to do something similar to what I ended up doing, which is maybe focusing more on where there's resonance. And he ended up doing a much heavier critique of Jung through Deleuze, and critiquing Jung of upholding the image of thought in some way through the image of the self, and basically saying it's too reified, it's too much of a closed hole that we just project into the past and reach back into it. It's not allowing for enough change and enough difference, so to speak. And it was really good because no one had, I think, dared to sort of go after Jung with such a blistering critique at that time. And he will publish that. I think he is planning on publishing that soon, which is good because it should be out there. Over the past 15 years, however long it's been, the Kerslake book, Deleuze and the Unconscious, has circulated much more through Jungian circles. And that's opened a lot of doors where people are seeing, okay, Jung actually is part of this philosophy that's dealing with a problematic unconscious, that goes at least back to Bergson, at least in that book. But Deleuze is drawing on Bergson, he's drawing on Leibniz, he's drawing on Jung and all the figures he brings into account there. And that book, I think, is then been followed by, for instance, Grant Maxwell's work, which does a similar way of installing Jung within this lineage. I think the biggest difference there, perhaps with Deleuze, is this concept of the virtual, which at times I see very similar to what Spinoza is trying to do with essence. The virtual doesn't have a defined shape or a defined form. It's at best maybe the contours of a process, but it's not a process that we should be giving a clear image to, because then that's defeating the whole purpose of it. And then you're back into a classical mode of essence, which definitely don't think that's what Deleuze wants. Spinoza, I think, in a lot of ways is wrestling with problems that I don't want to just let him off the hook by saying they're beyond his time, but he knows there's something there and he doesn't want to fall back onto necessarily a Neoplatonism or a scheme of eminence, but he doesn't quite know how to answer these questions either, which happens a few times in the scope of everything that he writes and builds. But he does start talking about essence in terms of just the power that pertains to whatever the essence is that we're talking about. So, for instance, if X, whatever X means, is germane to my essence, then that would be my essence. And the power is just an expression of God, and that can mean a lot of different things. It doesn't have to have an identity to it or a closed static whole. And that's more in sync, I think, with what Deleuze is talking about. How you connect either of them with Jung, that gets a little difficult, because again, you could totally go Neoplatonic and eminent with Jungian archetypes if you wanted to. And I think that's often what the metaphysical idealist approach to Jung ends up doing. And then you're just okay with it, where meaning is sort of coming down prearranged and pre-designed into us, where if you take the Spinozist approach, meaning becomes more a collision of modes at different scales and how it affects us. And it's happening in real time, if you will, but just at scales and rhythms that are beyond us, either because they're too large or too small. And it's not prearranged, which is why I say, okay, the collective unconscious might be equivalent to the attribute of thought, but it would actually be better to see the archetypes almost as individual modes of recurring human events. Because if you otherwise look at them as purely within the laws of God, then you're not doing service to Spinoza's God, which should allow for anything. And anything that's consistent here is almost just an anthropic principle, but it should be an absolute potential to create anything. And therefore, the things that we're familiar with, the archetypes that we see recurring in our lives, might just be patterns within, to use a physics analogy, this pocket of the universe, if you will. And this goes back to what we were talking about a little while ago about, can archetypes change? Can they be diminished or be more highlighted in certain periods of time? And I think that sinks more of that Spinoza's approach. In some ways, just because Deleuze is supersedes Jung within time, I think he has more of an ability to interface with Jung. And obviously Deleuze, very least early on, but like you said, even later in Anti-Oedipus, he mentions Jung, a difference in repetition. He contrasts the Jungian unconscious with the Freudian unconscious. He's dealing with Jung after the fact, so in some ways that makes it maybe a little easier. It's just to apply Deleuze to Jung, you have to be. It's why I really credit Christian McMillan for doing that. And in a different way, I did the same thing in my thesis. But what Christian did in his project was really to say, okay, we have to cut the unclear stuff out of Jung for this to work. Where you really have to, expose Jungian psychology to that critique of the image of thought, and to really try to get away of the eminence and the transcendent with a capital T, and therefore you might get more to that transcendental immanence. I kind of do, and in some ways I'm doing a similar thing, just from a Spinozist approach, as just coming from the back end of it, because obviously Spinoza precedes Jung.
I know you said that you were reading Anti-Oculus. I mean, that's precisely the project that I undertook in the last chapter, which is, how do we mobilize Deleuze's concept of the image of thought to undermine the reified monotheistic tendencies of Jung, the notion of the self? And in doing so, see how it has real political stakes, ultimately. Even somebody like Jordan Peterson, as much as we say that he's a distorted version of Jung, he's kind of the shadow of the Jungian tradition in some ways, at least from a political standpoint. Because, I mean, what what Jung wanted for his politics, as I understand it, and as I can best remember it, in like The Undiscovered Self, is if that we turn our attention to this introverted project of individuation, all as individuals, then that will somehow mushroom into a better political world. But psyche is everywhere. It's in the external world. It's in the institutions. It's in the way that we handle our waste and everything else. And so there are implications for that. And I don't know, I see there, the introduction of Spinoza to a Jungian project as bringing us closer to something like Deleuze or maybe even Hillman in a sense. But maybe in your own words, could you just say, what do you think is the upshot, or how does the introduction of Spinoza, or highlighting the parallels or synergies in their work, like what does that do for the practical application of Jungian psychology, or some sort of like depth psychology or post-Jungian variant of it?
Well, it's interesting you bring up Undiscovered Self, because also just as a whole, a real problem with Jung's approach to politics, and Andrew Samuels, the post-Jungian, has written well about this, is that, it definitely engenders this idea we just need a strong leader, right? And I'm not saying that Jung necessarily was yay fascism, but there's definitely that, okay, we're just going to go inward, into our own lighthouses, so to speak, and polish the light, and therefore we can project it out properly. I mean, it does engender the individual is what changes history. And that's certainly, part of what's problematic about a Jungian approach to politics. Now again, Peterson, to his credit, I think does understand that numinous side to Jung is important. What a lot of post-Jungians, I think, have done to fix this imbalance between the inner and outer, and how Jung valorizes the inner world so much at expense of the outer, is to say, for instance, okay, well, maybe we should jettison the eternal qualities of the self, the archetypal self altogether. Maybe synchronicity, it's too hocus pocus, let's say. So we should just get rid of synchronicity. The archetypes, maybe we should just talk about social constructs. I mean, I would argue in some ways that the primary mode of Jung in the academy right now is to talk about the archetypes in terms of social constructs. And there's merit to that, obviously. I think that's a step up from talking about them in terms of just somehow being genetically encoded magically, because that's a more brutish form of the same old problem. But what is the problem with this? Well, then my opinion, you're diminishing what makes Jung, which goes back to everything we've been talking about in terms of the power of dreams, the power of this feeling that there's a narrative happening to you that's bigger than you. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a classical pre-planned individuation with a midlife crisis and all that, which post-Jungians ranging from Hillman to Michael Fordham, the developmental Jungians, have done a good job of problematizing that classical narrative. But that's still that idea that the unconscious and the self is greater than you, and you sort of happen to yourself, rather than just the oft-quoted, the erroneous quote that Jung supposedly said, which as far as I can tell he never said, that's regurgitated on memes a lot, is, I don't happen to myself, I choose who I become. I'm sure you've seen that before, when really Jung says the exact opposite, which is, I kind of happen to myself, and I have to discover that process of myself happening to myself. And that's the stuff that makes Jung, everything we're talking about. And I'm not saying post-Jungians don't want that, they do. But to try to save Jung, to try to make him reputable for the academy or a marketable psychotherapeutic brand, ironically, it risks making Jung the opposite of what he should be, which is why it's very correct, I think, to say that Peterson in some ways is the ugly shadow of the whole movement, because, hey, man, he might be using it for some grifting ends, but he does get that numinous side of it. And I think that is part of his success. We might not like it, but I do think that's true. So what's the upshot? The upshot to me is Spinoza gives Jung an opportunity to say, we don't have to keep the numinous and the archetypal and the universal essence, eternity, restricted to the self. We can unmoor that. We can abolish the primacy of the self and say, okay, yes, I could find it in here, but I also might find individuating forces out there as well. So what's the benefit of that? Well, for one, it does become a much more interpersonal endeavor. It does become more of a plural endeavor. It does become something where we can deal with, like you said, individuation, and the psyche can be waste management. but then also it does say, okay, individuation doesn't have to be this classical story. If we're saying individuation, the discovery of the self, is the same thing as this Spinoza's weaponization of active affect. I used to joke that individuation could just be, for someone, individuation could be just eating an ice cream sundae on the couch. Now, for a lot of people, maybe that's unhealthy, maybe that's passive affect, but everyone's different. Everyone's essence is different. Everyone's self is different. And the upshot is the self is just another archetype being expressed on this transcendental plane of immanence, if you will. And that's sort of the connection metaphysically between Jung and Spinoza. And therefore, each of ourselves are different. And the only commonality, and it's a very important commonality, is we should be pursuing those active joys, or we should be pursuing that archetypal knowledge. And I think that's where Jung and Spinoza meet. And that's what I'm hoping, I think that's the key takeaway of the book, honestly.
No, that's great. And I think, to use your own analysis too, just to circle back to the whole reframing of Jung in terms of social constructs, making him politically palatable, runs the risk of doing something that Jung himself was trying to head off, which was according too much importance to matter in some ways. Like, there is the numinosity, the aleatory aspect of just, oh shit, I'm in the soup, and like you have just a weird dream and it feels really irrational and weird, and and it puts you in a space that's uncomfortable and unfamiliar, but also maybe pretty fascinating at the same time. And having a way to engage with that as an alternative to the forms of life that are just kind of cranked out by the system that we live in. And that's one of the values that I see in Jung's work and, the tradition that he has birthed. But Bob, we've gone quite a long time here. It's almost 10 o'clock. I wanted to thank you for coming on. We had a few false starts trying to get this interview going, but I'm glad we finally did. And maybe one way to end it is just to talk about what you're working on now and maybe what you're aspiring to as a next step after this dissertation.
So there's journal articles that I feel are overdue based on the work of the dissertation, and maybe, some new insights as well that I would like to try to get published in the Jungian literature. Basically about the two main arguments of the book, which is, why does Jung read Spinoza in such a peculiar way? And then also, what does this Jung Spinoza's tripartite monism look like? Those are two things I would like to write just separate articles about. I'm certainly interested in pursuing more just a pure Spinozist argument. In some ways, this thesis was defining my own version of Jung, but then it also became, I thought I had my own version of Spinoza, but that definitely changed a bit by the end of the thesis, which was rewarding. But that also led to some questions that I would like to answer. The most pressing one for me, or one that interests me the most, is the distinction between general and specific essences. Spinoza talks about everything that exists has an essence, and the essence defines its capacity to affect and be affected. But does Homo sapiens have its own essence? Does Bob have his own essence? Does Tim have his own essence? Does it collapse into another kind of taxonomy, which for Spinoza would not be an adequate idea? That's an interesting problem that there has been some scholarship about, but I would definitely like to see if I could contribute there in some way. And then as far as future things of Jung himself, I'm very strongly impelled to go back to what got me into Jung to begin with, which is psychological types. And because I feel like there's a lot to be said about typology. And again, it gets a bad rap, not unjustified, but it is Jung's psychology of the ego, and it sort of becomes therefore his compass of exploring the unconscious. So I'm very interested in exploring the philosophical developments of how he came up with, say, intuition, sensation, introversion, extroversion, and so forth. And then also maybe doing something instead of the typical pigeonholing, here's where your role should be in the office place, something more along the lines of using that to as a guideline for active affect, or this exploration of the unconscious, which there's certainly been some good work on. John Beebe out on the West Coast has done great work on that. But I would like to do that from this philosophical, depth psychological lens hybrid and see what comes from that.
Excellent. Is there anywhere where people can reach you, like a blog or a Substack or anything like that?
Yes. So I do have a website. It is creatively roberthlangan.com. And then also I am on Blue Sky. I recently evacuated Twitter, former Twitter. I'm on Blue Sky now. For now, it's okay. Although, like everything else, it seems like it'll get ruined sooner than later. But that's also at Robert H. Langan. So yes, you can find me on both of those places. Right now, at least on Blue Sky, there's a nice depth psychology and philosophy community. It's only a matter of time before gambling ads show up and it all gets ruined. But for now, it's okay.
All right, Bob. Well, it was great talking to you, and we'll have to have you back again someday when you have some spectacular new research.
It would be my pleasure, and thank you so much for having me on. This was a lot of fun.